They don't see that as the problem. They think, oh, this is the only example of advanced life in the entire universe. And so therefore, it's really, really important that we get off of this planet in order to secure a future out in space. They say it's more important than anything else. It's more important than preserving the environment here. It's more important than democracy. It's more important than civil rights. They also overlook that space is pretty bad for humans to live. This is the best place we've got.
We're going to talk a lot about what I call the eschatology, the end times fantasies of tech billionaires, some of whom have been on the show and have talked to in the past, including people like Peter Thiel and Marc Andreessen. Let's open with something that's really been a hot topic lately, which is the potential for AI boom or AI doom.
Yeah.
In this book, you come down relatively hard on the billionaires that are not only shaping our economy through their inventions, their technology, but also on their desire for control, manipulation, power, and perhaps even, as you call it, a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
What is going on with AI? How do you see it now? And what do you really see as the number one danger the audience would be, keen to pay attention to, if not panic? Let us know when we should start panicking.
Sure. Yeah. So, like you said, there's the AI boomers who think that, like a lot of these billionaires who, like Andreessen specifically is a great example, who think that really we just need to make AI go as fast as possible, scale up as big as possible, as quickly as possible, and it will solve all of our problems for us. And then on the other side, you have these AI doomers, people like this guy, Eliezer Yudkowsky, who I think we're probably going to talk about a bit more as we go on, and also the effective altruists, people from the same camp as like Sam Bankman-Fried, or if we want to pick a currently active tech billionaire, Dustin Moskovitz, who believe that AI in all likelihood is going to lead to, total extinction of humanity and the end of the world. I think that the evidence for either of these claims is pretty bad, because they're, in a lot of ways, are two sides of the same coin. And the reason I say that, even though their claims sound as far apart as possible, is that they're both predicated on this idea that AI is going to inevitably and in pretty short order become incredibly powerful and superhuman in not just its abilities, but in its intelligence, and just be more powerful and more intelligent and more capable than all of the rest of humanity and human civilization combined.
Super intelligence.
Right, exactly. And then that will lead to it being able to do whatever it wants with like godlike powers of creation and destruction. I think the arguments in favor of that happening are pretty bad, and the arguments against it are pretty good. So I think both the boomers and the doomers are sort of living in the same fantasy land, and they're both wrong. And that the biggest dangers we have around AI are the sort of normal dangers that we have around technology, right? That it'll be used to further concentrate wealth and power into the hands of a few without democratic accountability, that it will take existing problems in society and make them worse, existing biases and make them worse. And we're already seeing all of that happen. So I think it's just going to be more of the same, faster and faster.
Yeah, but more of everything.
Yeah.
More of everything, but faster and faster. Past guest Nick Bostrom has this famous thought experiment called the paperclip problem. You talk about it, and I was very, very impressed by the way this is described in the book, because as astrophysicists, you are an astrophysicist. Your first book was not even about AI or astrophysics. It was about quantum mechanics. We'll get to that later. Stay tuned. Those are breadcrumbs for later. But tell us, what are the kind of delusional or perhaps physics uninformed content hot takes of these billionaires, ranging from Elon Musk, who I spoke to very briefly on the podcast a year ago, and people like Nick Bostrom, who don't seem to factor in the so-called limits to growth and things that have been around for a very long time. So what are they missing, and that we should be getting, or lead us to be either less concerned about doom or more optimistic about boom?
The most obvious physics uninformed thing that Elon Musk in particular says is basically everything he ever says about Mars. He's just wrong about Mars. But when it comes to AI stuff, I mean, you've got people like boomers like Marc Andreessen in particular saying that AI is going to allow us to transcend all limits to growth and just have permanent growth of everything, or, more everything forever, hence the title of the book. And that's just not how physics works, right? We know that there are limits on everything that are imposed, if not by anything else, then ultimately by physics, right? Entropy and cosmology force there to be limits. There is only so much stuff in the universe. There's only so much energy in the universe. There's only so much free energy in the universe, energy that can be, energy in a useful form that can be used to do stuff before it reaches a state of maximal entropy. Now, some of these people do recognize that. Bostrom understands that limit. He understands that there's a limit imposed by entropy and limits imposed by cosmology. His response to that is to say, oh, then we need to go out and collect all of that available free energy before we lose it beyond the cosmic horizon, because otherwise, we'll have lost resources that we could have used to make life better. I think not only does that ignore other kinds of physical and biological and scientific limits, but it also is just a really bizarre and unhealthy response to the fact that we live in a limited universe.
There are those, though, that say that you're not being optimistic enough, Adam. You're saying things like the past people would speculate we're all going to be eating, Soylent Green. There's a population explosion. Yeah. Actually, the problem we should be worried about is overpopulation. Now it seems like underpopulation, according to some people. I take it from the exasperated side that you don't believe in that. But I want to take us back to the influence of science fiction on all these billionaires, and some are not billionaires, right? I don't think Yudkowsky might be a billionaire by now, or he certainly may.
Yudkowsky's not a billionaire.
On the way possibly to being one. But there are many other people in the book that you mentioned that aren't, from Werner Vinge, who was a proud graduate at UC San Diego, Kim Stanley Robinson. These are not billionaires. They're comfortable, but their visions do inform, a lot of the techno-optimistic future. And I'm, I wouldn't say friends with Peter Thiel, but we are, we've been in touch in a couple of conferences that he's graciously hosted a bunch of thinkers from different, sides of the political aisle, shall we say.
Sure.
But the question that I always have is, where else do we get inspiration if not science fiction? I mean, think about the fact that we're in the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination, or this is what it used to be. We have monoliths on our desk. We have a picture on your Keating medal for Nobel pursuits in literature that I give to all my wonderful guests who come here in person. That's a request for more in-person guests because I love to be in person. But these are people that shape the future through imagination, and the future was actually outpaced by their imaginations because not one of them had the internet in 1962.
Right.
And so if they really were soothsayers, they would have caught it. So where should we get our inspiration? And what is wrong with kind of the Star Trek versus Star Wars kind of ideological battle that you talk about Peter Thiel kind of suffering with or wrestling with in the book?
I don't want to bash away at science fiction, right? I am a huge science fiction fan. And I think I make that clear in the book. Yeah, I was raised on science fiction. I was raised reading Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Ray Bradbury, all of the greats, Alfred Bester, and then, more recent stuff as well.
Yeah, Ursula Le Guin. She was here for this. We used to do a lot of things with the speculative futures and science fiction. She spent a lot of time on this campus.
She's one of my favorite writers in any genre.
Right.
She's amazing. But, she also said, science fiction authors are not futurists, right? The job of science fiction is not to predict the future. And that she is a science fiction author and she took on the brave task of trying to speak for all science fiction authors. It's not, her job or the job of science fiction to predict the future, right? And that doesn't mean that science fiction can't be a source of inspiration. And it can be, it clearly is, and sometimes that's a good thing. But it's a question of what we take as inspiration from science fiction and how we see science fiction, right? Because science fiction is not a roadmap for the future, even if it can serve as a source of inspiration, right? Because sure, you can look at Star Trek and say, oh, I want those communicators. And now we have stuff that's essentially like the communicators, at least from, the original series. But you can also look at Star Trek and say, oh, I want to live in a world where, people work together to solve problems in that way. I want to live in a world where racial inequality is not an issue. I want to live in a world where, gender discrimination doesn't exist, especially for the original series of Star Trek and The Next Generation. Star Trek is sort of very, very clearly a kind of morality play, right? No. It's, and as I talk about in the book, it's not particularly subtle, and that can be a good thing. But, there are people who watch Star Trek and think, oh, Star Trek's about warp drive. I'm like, buddy, go back and look at just to both pick an episode at random and show like the deep level of nerdity that I have and love for Star Trek. There's an episode from the original series. I'm pretty sure it's called "Let That Be Your Last Battlefield," and it famously has I'm blanking on his name, but the guy who played, I think, the Riddler on the original Batman TV series,
Okay, wow.
as one of the guest stars. He's got
back,
these
yeah.
two guest stars, and one of them, half his face is white and half his face is black, and the other one, this half of his face is black and this half is white. So it's the same, but swapped. And one of them claims that the other one is like racially inferior and is chasing him around the galaxy until their planet burns. And this episode aired in 1968 in this country, a year of great, civil
Evil,
strife.
right?
Yeah. And racial unrest in this country. That episode was not about warp drive. That episode was about the dangers of racism and division. And so, Star Trek and science fiction, absolutely a source of inspiration, but it's a question of, okay, but what is this actually saying?
Yeah.
Right?
I see now a lot of parallels, ironically, between a lot of these techno-futurists, techno-optimists, who are, as I say, ironically, very secular in most of their practices or lack thereof, very much either self-professed atheists or agnostics at best, so to speak. And then this almost messianic, as I call it, scatological notion of AI as sort of the Godhead figure, and this notion that it's almost the Messiah that's going to lead us into the promised land. And where is the promised land? It's the great beyond. It's the final frontier. It's space. Talk about these weird parallels that are almost religious in nature, both from the characters you mentioned, Elias, these founding, kind of figures, the prophets, and also the apostates, the people that are kind of pushing back on them may have a little less financial firepower to go along with it. But talk about the battle between the religious fervor and the almost cult-like notions that some of these communities are taking on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is definitely a parallel here, right? The idea that the job of AI companies like OpenAI or Anthropic is to essentially build a god, right? Some of them actually talk about it as such in those words. The idea that, the goal is to have that god take us all to space so we can live forever. This just looks inextricably like going to heaven to live forever with God, right? And that parallel, I think, is not at all a coincidence, right? If you dive into the historical origins of these ideas of things like transhumanism, things like this, drive to take humanity to space as the next step, a lot of these ideas originally started out as religiously informed ideas, often from Christian movements. You get someone like Nikolai Fedorov saying that it's the common task of humanity to bring about a paradise in space through technology back in the late 1800s. You get someone like Teilhard de Chardin saying that you're going to have a self-reinforcing cycle of technology leading to humanity having godlike powers and eventually, bringing about a kind of paradise on earth and a joining with God. These notions ended up becoming very influential. Fedorov influenced Tsiolkovsky, one of the pioneers of rocketry, and his ideas, his cosmist inflected ideas that came from, among other people, Fedorov, ended up influencing Arthur C. Clarke. It was Tsiolkovsky who said that, Earth is the cradle, but you can't stay in the cradle forever. And then it was Clarke who wrote Childhood's End, right? Book that
Infancy's End would have been more appropriate. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. The title's a direct reference to that. And he even talks about Tsiolkovsky explicitly in a different book, Rendezvous with Rama. It was Teilhard de Chardin who, first took the word transhumanist and sort of brought it into this context of technological apotheosis, an eschatology of technology. And it was his friend, Julian Huxley, who grabbed that idea and brought it into a more secular context. But this idea is at its heart, I think, inextricably religious. And I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of these people come from like a lot of the leaders in these communities come from a deeply religious background and then, found atheism. But now I'm going to get real pretentious and also engage in some really irresponsible, guessing about what's going on in other people's brains. But
that's fine. It's your speculative future.
Yeah, exactly. There was a Nietzsche quote that I didn't use in my book that I thought about using, but ultimately couldn't find a way to do it. And it's something like, yeah, God's dead, but we're going to try to find some way of putting something, putting something into that God-shaped hole in our society, finding something else to call God. And I think this is a lot of that. This is, wouldn't it be nice if there were some omnipotent, omniscient being that could take care of us? And that's not going to happen.
I want to parlay this eventually into a connection between a topic that I think dovetails nicely, although you don't mention it in the book, but it's impossible for me to imagine you don't have an opinion about alien life and UAPs in the universe. It's not in this book, but the kind of, again, eschatological and messianic and cult-like behavior and religious fervor and supplement, surrogate, replacement of God, of religion with advanced civilizations that exist that are visiting us to do who knows what. But do you see parallels there? Is there, between these different communities, these different kind of cult-like structures as I see them?
So it's interesting because aliens do show up in the book a little bit, right? Mostly in that a lot of these people don't believe in them. Right. And I don't mean they don't believe aliens have come here and visited us and given us advanced technology. I don't believe that either. These guys don't believe that aliens exist anywhere.
Right.
They don't. Yeah, exactly. Like maybe there are bacteria somewhere, but they don't believe that there's anything like, an advanced
SETI.
Exactly. An alien civilization. And it's very interesting that they sort of go out and take that very strong position, which I think is, I don't think that that's true. The argument that they give for it, I think, is ludicrous. The argument they give is, well, inevitably, technological civilization is going to undergo something like a singularity and is going to go out and try to colonize the universe. And so the fact that we haven't seen any evidence of that we haven't seen evidence of Dyson spheres up in the sky, that we haven't seen, alien autonomous probes showing up here in our solar system.
Time travelers.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That means that we're alone. And therefore, the universe is here for the taking. And so I do think that there is something sort of religious about that, in the idea that, that means it's our universe. It's here for us.
Right. God so loved us, he gave us his only son, but we're his only son, and there's nothing else in the universe, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And the reason I brought that up is I share a very similar viewpoint. I'm open to it. I don't like to use the word believe as you did, but I say I think there's no evidence, and I think that's basically what you meant. I want to take that in a parallel track right now and talk about kind of the day after Aliens. So if you remember the great book and movie Contact by Carl Sagan and his wife, who's past guest on the show, Andreessen, very proud of that. Had her on way back when I first started. And Freeman Dyson, he was my first guest, by the way.
Amazing. He was a lovely man. I met him when I was in college.
Oh, actually, you did? Very briefly. Yeah. Well, it's too bad you didn't get to spend more time with him when you were here last. He's no longer with us, as they say. I had a conversation with Lex Friedman about that very scene in Contact where Bill Clinton it's a realistic scene. It's not CGI like most of the movie. Bill Clinton's on the White House lawn saying, if this discovery of this meteorite, he doesn't say the meteorite, but he says, if this discovery of alien, microbes or whatever, if that is proven and verified to be true, that will mark a new dawn for humanity, basically. And so that was actually true. As far as people knew, that was a meteorite discovered in Antarctica that had come from the planet Mars. This is your meteorite, for being a guest. This comes from Argentina.
Amazing.
Thank you. That meteorite was thought for many years, more than 2 decades, to be actually harboring signs of extraterrestrial life that originated on Mars, microbial, respiratory byproducts, perhaps, or microbes themselves. And I submit that 99% of the people that did know about that, saw the press conference or whatnot, they don't know that was never verified. In fact, it was refuted in some cases.
Right.
And second of all, they haven't changed their opinion on the existence of aliens one bit. In other words, it wasn't a big deal. And if you really care about, life in the universe, there's only one example. We can go down to the Pacific Ocean here, scoop up some water, and you get 10 to the 25th examples of life. And yet we don't seem to be putting as much effort into, the search for protecting life on Earth as we do for searching in life in the universe. Now, people like Jill Tarter will say that's an idiotic statement. So, but let's turn our astrophysical, eyes to that. The parallels between the search out there, because we may be it. That's the part I think it diverges in the AI and accelerationist and EA community, in that they're sort of stipulating we're it.
Yep.
Whereas the alien, maximalists are saying, no, we can't be it, because as Sagan said, it's an awful waste of space. How do those two things get reconciled? I mean, the notion that life, should be so abundant, and yet these accelerationists aren't taking as much care of the earth, at least from the perspective I gleaned from you in the book, as they could, or humanity or democracy. So talk about that. How do they overlook that if this is the only example of life in a universe of 10 to the 23rd possible planets?
It's a good question. They don't see that as the problem, right? They think, this is the only example of life, or at least, advanced life in the entire universe. And so therefore it's really, really important. It's more important than anything else that we get off of this planet in order to secure a future out in space. And there's a lot of problems with that, right? They say it's more important than anything else. It's more important than preserving the environment here. It's more important than democracy. It's more important than civil rights. They also overlook that space is pretty bad, right? That for humans to live, this is the best place we've got.
Yeah.
And there really isn't anywhere else. There is no planet B, as the saying goes, right?
Proxima Centauri B.
Right. There's Proxima Centauri.
Planet B.
Yeah. But yeah, like Musk wants to go to Mars. Mars is terrible. Right?
Yeah,
There's
Zach Wienersmith was on last year. City on Mars basically says it's impossible. And even if it were possible, you point this out in the book too. I just want to parenthetically, we're not going to spend much time on it, but he talks about the fact that, you might want to go to Mars, but does your great grandson want to be born on Mars?
Yeah.
And did you psychologically vet them? No, you didn't, because they weren't born when you took off with their future in mind. Anyway, go on.
No, totally. And Zach and Kelly's book is amazing, and I cite it in mine. It's a very good book. And Mars is terrible. There's nowhere in the solar system that we could go to except right here to like really live and work and build communities.
Why do you think they don't focus on, sorry to interrupt, but why do you think they don't focus on the habitable, known to be supporting life sustaining places? I've been to, at least one of them, the South Pole, which is not too dissimilar from where you spent your PhD or Michigan. I was in Wisconsin for part of my time, so I can make fun of that. But the South Pole, there are 45 people there right now in the middle of winter, coming up on the middle of winter for them, and or the oceans. I mean, we have 70% of the planet, right? And there's obviously abundant life there, and there's an almost infinite parameter space of life. Why is there zero? I mean, I know Eric Schmidt has spent some effort on this, but I think it's to get his mega yacht out there and get some tax deductions. I mean, Eric, if you're out there, I'd love to talk to you. But Adam wouldn't, because he doesn't think billionaires should exist. But anyway, let's talk about under the ocean and on the polar ice caps while they last, right?
Yeah. I mean, and you do see other things like, the Seasteading Institute people who want to go out there. But like, by and large, there's not nearly as much interest. And I think part of it is just like, it doesn't sound as sexy.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's something cool about space that is less cool about like Sea Lab. And
do you think it's partially militaristic? I mean, what would be a better PSYOP or better, covert op than to say, we're going to get, Starlink satellites and Blue Origin Kuipers out there, but really it's a cover for, weaponizing space?
I mean, I don't think that it's a deliberate PSYOP. There are certainly people who are interested in weaponizing space, and I'm sure they're very comfortable with this way of talking about space as a cover for that. But I don't think that that's what, say, Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, I don't think that that's what their ultimate goals are, right? They've been very, very clear that they want to go out into space to, save and secure the future of humanity. This is weird because space is awful, but yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult to understand why anyone would think that space is the inevitable future of humanity when you actually look at how awful it is and how difficult it would be to leave the solar system and go somewhere else where there might be a better, more habitable planet than the ones that aren't Earth here. But even those planets probably already have their own biospheres. And if they don't, they're still going to be very difficult to live on.
I guess a pushback might be, from an Elon, again, I've talked to him very briefly. His mom kind of bailed him out at the end when I said, well, which one of your kids, of your 14 kids that we know about, are you going to say goodbye to? Or,
Yeah.
which ones are you going to take with you? Which ones are you going to say goodbye? Because they're not all going to come. And
Right.
would you want to bring a 3-year-old to Mars? I don't think that's a very good plan. And his mother just, kind of interrupted the conversation. Said, let's not talk about unpleasant things. Right? So Mama May, she bailed him out. But when we think about, kind of the ultimate goal in going into space, again, it's this theme that runs throughout the book that's so rich is long-termism.
Yeah.
And that if you don't think that way, you are an obstructionist, you're a decelerationist, you're a pessimist or what have you. And you trace it in the very beginning of the book to this notion of what is called, I think it's very hubristic, if that's a word, to say that they're effective altruists.
Right.
This notion is like the French Enlightenment, calling themselves the Enlightenment as they cut off the heads of Lavoisier and greatest of minds of their generation rolled into a basket, as it was said. Talk about this, the notion that they know better and we should be listening to them, because you're not doing effective altruism when you give charity, tzedakah, tithing or whatever. We're going to tell you how to do it, and it's really just a code word for we know what's best because we are these superhuman brainiacs. So talk about effective altruism and the repugnant conclusions I claim it has for this movement that may come to dominate technology and democracy.
There are a lot of weird names in this space, right? That sort of have that same flavor, right? There's the effective altruists. My favorite is the rationalists. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to call ourselves like the correctists.
That's right.
There's one of my favorite TV shows is Parks and Rec.
Yeah.
And there's this group, this cult on Parks and Rec called the reasonableists. And I just always think of them when I think of the rationalists. But yeah, the effective altruist, it is one of these things that sounds unobjectionable on the face of it. Right? Like, oh, we're going to find the most effective ways to do the most good. But the devil, as always, is in the details, right? What do you mean by effective? What do you mean by good? What do you mean by the most good? And this leads you sort of inexorably to this idea, long-termism, that, well, if you want to do the most good, you need to help the most people. Where are the most people? Well, they're in the future, right? They're the future generations that will come after us.
Not only separated in space, but separated in time.
Exactly.
A lot more separated in time than in space.
Right. Or there could be, at least. Right. Yeah.
10 to the 23rd.
Right. Exactly. They have these absurd calculations. Right. And that gets to the heart of it, right? Because we don't know what the future holds, and we don't know what future people will need. It's very, very hard to make accurate estimations about like what generations, even 10 generations down the line, much less, 1,000 generations down the line, will need, if and when they're scattered across space. Mm-hmm. And to the effective altruist, this repugnant conclusion that they come to is this idea that, more people, as long as their lives are at least barely worth living, is always better. Right. Makes the world and the universe a better place. And so this creates what one very prominent effective altruist, Will McCaskill, calls a moral case for space settlement. Yeah. But again, space is terrible. There is no moral case for space settlement, and you can't do that to your descendants, right? But there's also the bigger problem of like, well, why is that what they want? Why do they think that a better world is just one that has more people, almost no matter what? I think a smaller population living happier lives is better. And this is like a well-known paradox in philosophy that, people have sort of bashed their heads against for years. And there's a reason that it's, a paradox. It's very difficult to sort of
assign utility functions.
Yeah, exactly.
Optimize for,
right.
They attempt to bring their engineering kind of credentials to it.
Right. Yeah. It's this idea that you can quantify absolutely everything. And I just don't believe that that's true. Mm-hmm. Right. Like if you want to defend this, then you got to have this way of determining like, okay, what is good and what is good across an entire population? How do you evaluate different kinds of happiness within one person and then across different people, across all populations, across all generations, literally until the heat death of the universe? Mm-hmm. If you have a way that you think of doing that you think works, even in principle, I'm just not going to believe you.
I see it as kind of an analog of the Drake equation, which is highly speculative and filled with, errors and the biggest errors that there's no errors assigned to any of the terms in the equation. And so it becomes just a framework, but so forth. And then people use it and they make these calculations of similar types of figures. As Adam Frank, another past Adam astrophysicist, has said on the show, there could be 10 to the 24th Avogadro's number of planets, right?
Sure.
Okay. In the history history of the observable universe. Okay, I care about those within 100 light years of me, right? So we can at least plausibly have communicated once, at least in one direction. But there are these parallels, and I think that again, there's this chord of escape. I can't help thinking, I call myself a devout practicing agnostic, where I think a scientist could be open to, being swayed, but never should say that they believe in something without evidence. I think that's problematic for a scientist to say. And nevertheless, to be open, to be completely closed off to it, I find in my personal life, with my children, my family, to be more infused with meaning, so to speak. So I practice, but the level of which belief comes in is another matter. But these people, I think they are trying to replace this, either God-sized hole or something that's missing in their life. And now we could psychoanalyze. I don't think that's important, but I do think it's interesting to consider. So Marc Andreessen follows me on X, Twitter, where you are rarely seen nowadays. I tried to post to you, but you're protected and blocked.
Oh, sorry.
Everything else, but that's all good. We can find you on Blue Sky. Or Mastodon. Have you been to Mastodon?
I have, although it's a little quieter. I'm mostly using Blue Sky these days.
Marc Andreessen, if I had to channel him, I might think that he would say something like, look, Becker, you're in the elite of the elite, 0.10001% of the population, educated Western institutions, conversant with technology, the finest education, background, pedigree. You're living this comfortable life. And so you're criticizing the very people that deliver, in his case, developing, Netscape, Mozilla, leading to at least the commercialization, popularization, which led to his great wealth, by the way, of the internet, through the World Wide Web browser, which was, we can talk about its origins. Yeah. But what would you say to him? I mean, he might criticize this. I mean, he comes off as, if there is a villain, there's not really a villain in the book, but he comes off kind of the most deserving of the most opprobrium, at least as you dish it out in the book. Thiel's kind of, Musk is a very, very close second, maybe tops. Who knows? You'll have to say. But what would he say about this critique? I mean, if we could channel him, Steelman, his argument. Look how much it's given you. I mean, you personally. I mean, you flew down here on an airline. You'll stay in a chain hotel. You'll eat the finest food that the campus can deliver. Technology. We communicated via email over the web. You published in a major publishing house book. I listened to it in audio, read it in print. These are all things done. Bezos, and we can talk about Google and the Brins and the Pages, et cetera. But talk about what they'll say. Like you're now kind of coming down with this harsh critique of the very abundant future which you were given. You say in the book they didn't earn it completely. They might say the same to you. How would you react to that?
I think like any good millennial, there are some internet memes that just live in my head rent free and probably just will forever, right? And the one that's coming to mind right now is this sort of one panel cartoon of like a medieval looking peasant doing back-breaking labor and, like literally hunched over with like a big pile of wood on their back in a cap covered in mud saying, we should improve society somewhat. And then over on the side of the panel, someone dressed in like modern clothing is sort of sticking their head up out of a well saying, but you participate in society. Curious. I am very smart.
It's kind of the human version of the meme where the wolves come upon a campfire and they say, "Oh, we should really investigate that campfire," to themselves, and then fast forward 10,000 years and there's a teacup poodle inside of Paris Hilton's handbag. So it's the human version of that.
Kind of, yeah. It is absolutely true that I participate in society, right? And that this is a society shaped in large part by the decisions made by the tech billionaires that I criticize in the book. The fact that I participate in that society and have benefited from various things in that society does not mean that I don't get to criticize it, right? It means that I should be aware of the ways in which I have benefited from living in this society. And I am, I know that I have been very lucky. I was lucky to be born to the parents that I was born to. I was lucky to be able to go to the schools that I went to. I was lucky to get my first book deal and my second book deal. That doesn't mean that everything is great, right? Just because I have been able to benefit from certain things in society doesn't mean that, therefore I cannot possibly criticize society. It just means like there are problems. And I think it would be better if we address those problems. And would addressing some of those problems possibly make my life a little bit worse than it is right now? Maybe. That's possible. I'm okay with that because I think that it would be better if we lived in a more just world where more people had the chance to not even live the kind of life that the billionaires live, but just the kind of life that I live. Because, one of the things I thought about doing before the book came out was I thought about making a bingo card of different reactions I figured I would get to the book. And one of the reactions I knew would show up in an internet forum somewhere. And I want to be really clear. This is not what you're saying. It's not even what you're saying Marc Andreessen would say. Right. But one of the criticisms I knew would show up somewhere was, Becker's just trying to profit off of, these crazy things that these people say. He's just a grifter. And I'm like, buddy, if you say that, you have no idea how book publishing works. Like, this is not a money-making endeavor for me.
Broke slowly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I was just talking with someone last night and said, "Oh yeah, after I did my PhD, I went into science journalism because I thought, academics make too much money. I want to do something that makes less money than that.
Too spoiled by riches."
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I am fully open to and have accepted that. Yeah, absolutely, I have benefited from living in the society that we live in. That doesn't mean that I don't get to say, hey, I think we should change this. I think it'd be better if this were different.
Yeah, and it's a very different book than the other books that I've read or, participated in. Max Tegmark, obviously, is sort of a doomer, as people call him, and gets criticized for that. And then Jan LeCun, and I had them battling each other. It's pretty funny to watch them, at least remotely by text message. But at the end of the day, what really feeds this, I see as sort of a cycle, where you've got these tech unicorns that fuel, kind of this epistemic, kind of conceit that they have solved something and are worth $1 billion. So they're really smart, right? So we should listen to whatever they say. And then that includes extracting, both resources, monetary resources, but also political power which is possible in a democracy. And I see this loop or, could be a doom loop, but I want to ask you kind of a flip side of that. What are you optimistic about in this future? I mean, AI has transformed the way I do research, the way I teach. Has it done as much as the internet? As I think Cho and Lai said about the French Revolution, 1972, it's too soon to tell, will it, really supersede? But, we're just at the very nascent beginning of it where, I haven't even brought in my autonomous robot, to replace my job as a professor. Yeah. But what are you optimistic about? It could be in education. I mean, you're very familiar, conversant with the educational system. And what are you optimistic about the AI that's not doom related, that you actually think is going to be a net benefit, both not necessarily of the people in the book. You can compliment them all you like, but what are you optimistic about in terms of, both education, economics, and perhaps, more broadly, kind of technology in the future?
I'm going to go for the last part of that first, right? Like, I think that there's all sorts of wonderful things to be optimistic about regarding technology in general, right? I have a cousin who's a cancer researcher, and there have been amazing leaps and bounds in cancer research in the last decade due to this sort of new direction of cancer research having to do with getting cancer patients' own immune systems to learn how to fight the cancers that they have. I'm very optimistic about that because I've, talked with my cousin and other experts on this and came to the conclusion, this sounds really great. Or rather, they came to that conclusion and convinced me, because they know what they're talking about. That sounds amazing. I think I don't want to say it looks like the cure to cancer is within reach, because I don't know about that, but we're definitely going to be able to treat cancers that were previously untreatable and are already able to do that. That's amazing, right? That's really great. I think that there's amazing applications for mRNA vaccines, right? They're not just for COVID. I think that, it's in a way too soon to tell what's going to happen with that, but it's looking pretty good. So yeah, all sorts of amazing biomedical advances. I am optimistic about green technology. It's just been getting cheaper and cheaper. That's amazing. I think that if we decide as a civilization that we are finally ready to make that transition to renewable energy as a primary energy source, that's just way more possible than it was even 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? That's incredible. I am still really, really worried about global warming, but it makes me less concerned about us having the tools, the technological tools that we need to address it. Now that we have most of them, it's primarily a political and social problem rather than a technological one. And that's great. There's any number of other things that I'm optimistic about regarding technology and the way that it can be applied. AI, these machine learning tools that we have now, There are all sorts of wonderful applications. This isn't generative AI, which I'll get to in a second, but I didn't use any generative AI in the writing of either of my books, except for one paragraph in the new book where I say, here's a thing that I got ChatGPT to say, right? Where like, very clearly that's generative AI. The rest of it is not, right? So unless I'm quoting ChatGPT, it's all me.
Right.
But non-generative AI, right? Like audio transcription, it's incredible. As a journalist, I use that quite a bit because it's really, really helpful to have a first pass at a transcript of what somebody said to me. And is the transcript perfect? No. Is it ever going to be perfect? I don't know. Maybe there's a lot of different ways that people speak, but it doesn't need to be. I just need to be able to get a few key words so I can find the spot in the hour-long transcript where they say the one thing that summarizes the thing they spent the last 20 minutes saying. And so I can use that in the article or the book or whatever it is that I'm writing. It's incredibly useful for that and has made it much easier for me to do my job. Although that is also an example of somebody losing a job because of AI, right? I previously hired someone for my first book. I hired a dear friend of mine who was looking for work. I said, well, look, I have this grant to work on this book. I can give you some of that money if you transcribe these interviews. And so she did that. For the new book, I didn't have to do that. I just had to sign up for the subscription, which was even cheaper. But nonetheless, like as with most other technologies, okay, some jobs go away, but then new jobs are created, right? And I think we're going to see a lot of that with AI. Generative AI is a trickier case, right? Because there are costs there that don't exist in the same way, or at least at the same scale as there are in other AI systems, right? There's environmental costs, right? The carbon cost, the cost of the water that's being used to cool the systems, the resources that are extracted in order to build the systems in the first place. There's the intellectual property that was used in ways that are allegedly theft to train these systems, right? And I find it quite rich that you get people like Sam Altman or Nick Clegg saying, but if we had to pay for the intellectual property rights, then these AI systems wouldn't be profitable. I'm like, okay, two things. First of all, they're still not profitable. Like OpenAI's never turned a profit. And second, that's a problem. Like but not the way that you think it is. It means that these systems, you should have maybe talked to somebody before building these things. And then there's also the human cost, the labor that's being exploited to train these systems out of producing dangerous content, which first of all, it's not, even completely successful, right? You can still get these systems to produce dangerous content or content that looks dangerous and by virtue of looking dangerous becomes dangerous. Like, giving you instructions for what it claims is like a medicine, but instead if you take it, it'll poison you or something like that. But, or fake bomb making instructions that will blow up in your face if you try to build them or something like that. But, they trained it out of, or tried to train it out of producing like child sexual material, which is very important for them to train it out of doing because they can't have it put it out on the internet. But in order to do that, they had to hire people at very, very low wages, usually in the developing world, to be exposed to some of the very, very worst of what the internet can produce, because these things speak with kind of the smeared out averaged voice of the internet. And so if you ask them to do horrible things, they will produce things a lot like the worst things that anyone's ever put on the internet. And it's caused real psychological trauma for the people who've done this. Karen Howe, who has a great new book out called Empire of AI, she documented this really, really well, I believe in her new book, which I haven't read, but also definitely in her reporting for the Wall Street Journal and MIT Technology Review and whatnot. These are real human costs. And, if you want to have these systems out on the internet without having them produce easily such content, either you need to not have them on the internet or you need to harm these workers. And the choice that these companies have made is to harm these workers. And so with all of those harms, and this is also putting aside the harms that are coming from the people using these systems, right? The AI-induced psychosis cases that are being seen and the exactly. And the de-skilling that people are like undergoing as they rely on it more and more to do things that they themselves used to do. Even putting those things aside, it makes it very hard for me to say that it's okay to use these generative AI systems, or at least to use them widely, because it's it's really like very hard to defend ethically what these companies like OpenAI and Anthropic have had to do along the way to producing.
I noticed
these
you
things.
left out Llama and Meta's products, which are open source.
Oh, sure,
Are
yeah.
they less problematic?
I'm not sure that they are.
Okay.
I know less about them,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I left them out. I know that at the very least they probably had to train on similar corpuses of intellectual property and probably using similar
Facebook.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I am skeptical that they're okay. I don't know as much about them.
Well, one of our favorite traditions on this podcast is to do what you're not supposed to do, which
Okay.
is to pass judgment on a book by solely looking at its cover. So we call this judging books by its cover. We even have a little jingle, which we'll start now.
Hey, book lovers, we're judging books by their covers. We know we're not supposed to do it, but into the impossible, there's nothing to it. Let's take a look and judge some books.
So, Adam, what we like to do is have an author take us through the title, the subtitle,
Yep.
and the beautiful. You're not known for it. That's the only shortcoming I'll say of the book. So, walk us through the title, subtitle, and the at least the stellar background on this book.
Yep.
And then our next episode we'll talk about this one.
The title of the book, More Everything Forever, is sort of what came first out of all the things on the cover, aside from my own name, which I was not responsible in the choosing of my name. But so about halfway through the time that I spent working on the book, it sort of pivoted to being about something a little different than it had been about when I initially, suggested it to my publisher, and they took the proposal and gave me a book deal. And when I made that change, a lot of things that had been floating around in my head that I knew had to go into the book, but I wasn't sure how to make them go in the book, just kind of clicked and fell into place. And I found myself finally writing a draft that I liked of a chapter that ultimately ended up becoming chapter 1 of the book. And not very far into that chapter, I realized, what would make a good title for this book is More, Forever. And so originally that was the title. And then I finished writing a very early, very rough draft of chapter 1, and then sent it to a dear friend of mine who's also a writer, and said, hey, what do you think of this? I think this is where I'm taking the book. And I'd already sent that to my editor. My editor liked it, but this friend of mine is one of the very few people I was also showing drafts of the work to at various points. And he read it and he said, I think this is great. Obviously, it's an early draft and it needs some work. I also think your title isn't More Forever. I think your title is More Everything Forever. And I said, oh, damn it, you're right.
It's like Facebook was originally the Facebook,
right?
We
exactly,
learned from the social network.
Exactly, yeah. It was like that. I saw, I saw what he said, and I'm like, oh, damn, that's right, isn't it?
Good.
It's very
Better to
good.
get that feedback early.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I took that to my editor, and he said, oh yeah, that's just absolutely correct. And so we had the title, and then the subtitle we knew had to involve AI and space, because the title of the book is good, but it doesn't really give you a sense of like what the book's about.
Right.
And so, we kicked around a few different ideas for a while. And then finally, once we had a fully like finished and, stable draft of the book, once I'd finished that, I sat down with my publisher and then, with my editor and then his boss, the publisher, and ultimately, kicked around a few ideas. And then finally we said, okay, let's do this one more time. And one of the first things that I think I was the one who wrote it down and not one of them, but I'd have to go back and confirm, was this subtitle. And my editor's boss saw it and she said, yeah, that's it.
You received the most prized possession in all of San Diego County, which is to get the Keating Medal. Now, this is loosely modeled on the Nobel Prize. And in the book, you talk about the repository for germinal choice, although you call it by its more common name, the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank.
Yes.
Which was actually here in Escondido, which is in North
really?
San Diego County. Yeah, we can go take
sense.
make a deposit. No, I'm just kidding. We don't have the Nobel Prize where
No,
so
we
it
don't.
was actually shut down. So this was actually developed in part by many of the kind of Silicon Valley Nobel laureates, including William Shockley, who had reportedly had the maybe distinction or maybe humiliation of being ranked one of the lower IQ candidates that won the Nobel Prize, but nevertheless, he did win the Nobel Prize, so we have to give it to him. But he was a big proponent of eugenics, and many of the people that were early pioneers were at least eugenics adjacent, shall we say? How is AI, perhaps impacting underrepresented communities, racism, playing into it? Is that just amplifying what's latent in society, or is it something that's generative in the worst possible sense of the word?
I think it's a little of both. It's definitely amplifying stuff that's already there, right? It's taking these existing biases and just, making it possible to automate them, because it just takes existing data, which, reflects these biases, and then says, oh, okay, I guess that's, if that's the goal, then this is what we're going to do. And that's not even restricted to generative AI. That's something you'll see in almost any machine learning system that's been, trained on human behavior. Right. But there's also sort of a deeper philosophical tie as well, which I talk about in the book, which is the idea that intelligence is this single number that you can sort of dial up or dial down is historically something that is strongly associated with eugenics, right? Even IQ testing is strongly associated with eugenics. It's part of why the IQ test was developed. And so it's not particularly surprising to see that, in communities that have formed around the idea of AI and super intelligent AI, where you just dial that knob all the way to the right, that there's not just this sort of historical philosophical connection with eugenics, but that a fair number of people in these communities actually advocate for various forms of eugenics, right? And this is something, like I said, I talk about this in the book. There are people in the effective altruist and rationalist communities, which is where a lot of this modern thinking about AI and AGI came from, who are very comfortable and advocates for a kind of racist pseudoscience called human biodiversity, which is something I went and talked with a fair number of geneticists, and I think it's the longest endnote in the book, actually. It's 2 or 3 pages long, where I talked with them, and they said, oh yeah, that's nonsense. That is not science. And yet there are full-throated defenses of it made by some prominent people in these communities. And I don't think it's a coincidence.
Yeah.